Hello, my name is Marcus Krieger. I work for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, and we are in a museum in Moorhead, Minnesota, right on the Minnesota-North Dakota border, right across the river from Fargo, North Dakota. And we are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so there's a lot of schools that are out right now, a lot of schools that booked a tour to our museum and can't come anymore. So I've been asked by some teachers to give a virtual tour of this exhibit, which is especially pertinent right now because our local history exhibit is about what was going on exactly 100 years ago right now, which is war, flu, and fear, World War I and Clay County. So this is Clay County, Minnesota, and World War I and the Spanish influenza pandemic. So I'm going to give you short snippets of tours around this exhibit, like you would find if you were able to come here on a school tour. And this is perfectly okay for you grown-ups to watch too. Okay. So I am recording this right now, this tour of the museum, because there's a lot of people who can't come to the museum because the museums are closed in Minnesota. The schools, all the school tours that booked for May are canceling because the schools are closed. And everybody is thinking back to the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. So that was really the last time that a virus had this much effect on the world. And we're all hoping that it's not going to be anywhere near this bad. So the Spanish influenza pandemic, it hit us in 1918 and it came back during flu season in 1919. And this was bad. They think that 1 out of every 3 human beings on planet Earth got sick with the flu in 1918 and 1919. And 2% of those people who got sick died of it. So that you bring that all around the world, that's a whole lot of people. That's 50 to 100 million people. We're not even sure how many people died, but certainly more people died of this flu than died in the war. And so that's one of the main reasons why 1918 is probably the scariest, saddest, crummiest year in the history of Clay County, Minnesota. So one local farmer named Levi Thortvedt, he wrote in his diary, "Disease known as Spanish influenza. As long as I have lived, I have never seen so many deaths in and out of the country, all over the world. We are afraid, and it ain't over yet." So then and now, people were looking for anything that might help. This is an ad from a Moorhead newspaper in 1918. That is saying, buy this stuff and it might make you better. Well, it didn't. We didn't really have a cure back then, just as we don't have a cure for this yet, but hopefully that'll change. And people were panicking at the stores too. Like right now, everybody is buying up all the toilet paper for some reason. Well, there was a letter home from an Army mess sergeant who wrote to his sister in Fargo that he's feeding his men lemonade and onions, and that kept his men healthy. When she shared that letter, there was a run on lemons and onions at the local grocery store. And one of the most dangerous jobs in America at the time were nurses, because nurses like Signe Lee here, because she was helping sick people, right? She's a U.S. Army nurse. So nurses were a dangerous job, doctors were a dangerous job, but being a soldier was a dangerous job because here's a picture of a whole bunch of soldiers during the flu pandemic in the fall of 1918 not practicing social distancing, right? They are all bunched together. And it's not just Spanish influenza we have to worry about. It's meningitis, it's colds, it's one guy standing here might be from Indiana and his flu is different than the guy standing next to him who's from Florida. And Minnesotans don't have antibodies to either of them. That's why a lot of times when you travel, you get sick. And they think that it was in a place like this, in a U.S. Army camp like this, that actually Spanish influenza might have started. So the reason that we call it Spanish influenza is because we first heard reports of it in Spain. And the reason that we first heard reports of it in Spain wasn't because it came from Spain, but because they were one of the few countries that were not at war at the time. And so it was spreading all around the rest of Europe too, but England didn't want to put in their newspapers, help, we're all sick and, from the flu over here and the country's about to collapse, because they didn't want their enemies, the Germans, to think that they're weak. And the Germans didn't want to put that the flu hit them either, because they don't want the English and the French to think that they're weak. It was only in Spain, who wasn't taking a side in this war, that Spain was not fighting this war. So they didn't have press censorship saying that they couldn't talk about the flu. So when Americans first heard about the flu, they thought it came from Spain. But really, what happened was, scientists now believe that it might have started in Camp Funston, Kansas, a U.S. Army camp, where this whole, all these American soldiers were kind of sharing each other's diseases because they're not practicing social distancing. They're all getting each other's different regional bugs. And they developed a really contagious flu that at first everybody kind of shrugged off and lived through. But then we took it over to France, and our jumble of American flu bugs mixed with the flus that were in England and France and Germany and also Morocco and China. This was a world war, and everybody was in France, all sharing each other's diseases, and it becomes especially deadly over in the trenches of France. And then our soldiers bring that flu back home to the USA, and it spreads all across the USA and causes really a lot of damage. And now people were asked to social distance. People were asked to quarantine if you were sick. So I remember just giving a tour of this exhibit maybe a month ago or 2 months ago, and having to explain to the kids what quarantine meant. And I think that kids nowadays will all know about it. And I want, just in closing about this, I want to say that people asked a lot of Americans during World War I and during the Spanish influenza pandemic. And a lot is being asked of us now too. And if we're smart, if we can learn from history, and if we can do our duty just like our great-great-grandparents did their duty in World War I, then we will be able to get through this in a lot better than we did in 1918 and 1919. Nurses were some of the heroes of World War I. They helped people during this time of combat and also during this time of influenza. One nurse that I always pay particular attention to is Signe Lee. Signe Lee she grew up a daughter of early Red River Valley pioneers, Norwegian immigrant pioneers on the Buffalo River between Moorhead and Glendon. And I always pay attention to Signe Lee because I live in her house. And so here's Signe here. And Signe was, when the war started up, Signe joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. And she served in Army camps in Texas and in New York and New Jersey. And Signe actually kept a scrapbook of her days of being a U.S. Army nurse. And she gave her scrapbook to the Minnesota Historical Society. And so we were able to reproduce some of these, some of her scrapbook pages here. These photos over here are from her camp in Texas. And it was in Texas, she was there when the flu spread to Texas. Because it came when on a U.S. Army troop train that was not doing social distancing, right? They put all sorts of sick people and healthy people all in a train, and they sent that train to Texas and got everybody in Texas sick. And so this is a photograph. Signe is the one with the dark shirt and the skirt and the hat. And the caption to this photo says, "First up patients, Ward 27 following the flu." And so these are some of the first survivors of the flu at her Army camp in Texas, which she served at Camp MacArthur and Camp Sam Houston. So there was a bandstand over by over across the street from Ward 27. Ward 27 is the ward she was in charge of. And then after she served in Texas, she went to New York and New Jersey and served in hospital ships for all the soldiers. After we won the war, all the soldiers started coming home, but they started coming home sick, right? This is the middle of a flu pandemic. And we just packed a whole bunch of soldiers. Some of them are sick, some of them are well, onto these troop ships and sent them back home. And so when they got to America and to port, thousands of people would come off at the boat at a time, and a lot of them would be sick. And so Signe Lee helped those sick soldiers coming back home to America. And it was in one of these hospitals that Signe herself became sick in New York. And she got an honorable discharge in the Army. That means that you did a good job, but you're not able to be an Army nurse anymore because you're sick. And her time in the as an Army nurse gave her a permanent heart condition, but it didn't stop her from living a good long life. She died in her 90s. So that's the story of an Army nurse serving in Army camps. But there were also a lot of hero nurses here in Moorhead and in your hometown, wherever you're living. There were nurses that were serving and helping out during this flu pandemic. And we have a scrapbook of photos from nurses here in Moorhead's Northwestern Hospital. And these are from the scrapbook of Cora Alberg, who was a friend of a lot of nurses. And it just shows some of the, it shows candid snapshots of nurses being goofy, having fun. And these were some of the hero nurses who helped America out during the Spanish influenza pandemic. I'll just do a few more shots here. We don't know the names of these nurses, but I like that there's photos of them smiling. Here's a photo of them just giving good care to a kid who's sick. Here's a staged one. They're being goofy. It's a nurse and a soldier seeing each other off to war. And here they are. Here's some nurses at Northwestern Hospital. And this one down here, they're having some fun on a bicycle. Let's talk about technology 100 years ago. Here we have a couple examples of 1918 tech. So let's go through them here. What do you think this thing is here? You can go ahead and take guesses at home because nobody's really going to hear you. What do you think? This is a telephone. This is a telephone, and we're not supposed to touch things in museums, but you know what? I work here, so I get to touch things. The way that you use it is this here. This goes in your ear, so you can hear. And this is where you look at the internet. No, I'm kidding. There was no internet. That's what you talk into. You have to talk into that. So how do you think they put phones in their pockets back then? Did they have really big pockets? Did they have really big pants? Nope. Back in the olden days, phones were on walls. You couldn't take your phone in your pocket with you. So probably a lot of your ancestors 100 years ago would have had a phone like this. Maybe not everybody, but even poor farmers by this time could have a telephone. How about this thing? This thing. What is this? There's a hint. Clothes wringer. All right, this is a washing machine, kind of a washer dryer combo. So what you do is you put your clothes, your dirty clothes in there, fill it up with water, put some soap shavings in it, then you close this lid, and then you spin this wheel, and then that thingy there jostles all the clothes around in the soapy water, and then you take the wet clothes out and you stick them through the wringer, and you squeeze. Use that handle there to squeeze a lot of water out of it. But are the clothes completely dry yet? No. How do you dry them? You can go ahead and guess. How do you think they dried clothes 100 years ago? That's right. They used a clothesline. So some of you might have a clothesline in your yard. In fact, back your grandparents, probably in the 1950s and 60s, your family might have still been using clotheslines out back. All right, and then there's this. What might this be? It's got an upper compartment in here that is lined with metal. What do you think it is? A lot of kids think that maybe this is an oven, but it's actually the opposite of an oven. This is an ice box. You can think of it like a refrigerator. But back 100 years ago, we hadn't figured out how to make electricity, make something cold, make ice. We hadn't figured that out yet. So where do you think ice came from? Well, if you live in Minnesota, ice came from outside. So us Minnesotans, we used to make a lot of money by going out in the winter when it's cold and sawing giant ice cubes out of our lakes and rivers, and selling. But we keep some of that ice for ourselves. But a lot of the other ice we would put on insulated trains, and we would drive them down. We would send them down to places where it's hot, because Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, they like to drink iced tea, but they can't make ice in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi or Brazil. So if they want to drink iced tea, they're probably drinking Minnesota lake water 100 years ago, which is kind of gross. All right, last bit of 1918 technology. What do you think this is? What does this do? This plays music. They called it a phonograph. And this would have been, kind of newish technology. I bet not a lot of our ancestors would have had one of these. This would have been fancy. But that doesn't mean that we didn't like music or we couldn't listen to music. If your family didn't have one of these, how would they listen to music back then? You can think about that. Well, they'd play music. You are all descended from musicians. Music has always been important to people, no matter where they're from. And and a lot of your ancestors would know how to play the piano or the banjo or the guitar or the fiddle. And when they want to hear the hot new song of the summer of 1918, they wouldn't buy it on iTunes. They wouldn't buy a CD of it or a record of it. They would buy the sheet music for it and play it at home and maybe invite some friends over. A lot of them would have been in bands. There would have been a lot more public concerts back then. And if you were to go to a dance, like you might have at your school now, if you were to go to a dance, there'd be a live band. All right. The most important organization on the home front back here in the USA during World War I was the Red Cross. And this was a very important organization that helped everybody. And this is their symbol. Can you see that symbol? That little red cross? Where have you seen that symbol before? Have you seen it today? I bet you have. I bet you've seen it on ambulances. I bet you've seen it on hospitals. I bet you've seen it on Band-Aid boxes. And the Red Cross was so important. What the Red Cross does is they make hospitals. And in World War I, that was the biggest war that had ever happened in the history of the planet up to that point. Do you think we need some hospitals? Absolutely we did. And do you think our hospitals cheap or expensive to run? Yes, they are absolutely expensive. And so what we all did here in the USA is we helped pay for and stock the hospitals with supplies. So hospitals in France and here in the USA too. So each one of these little dots, this is a map of Clay County, Minnesota. Each one of these little dots with words by it is a separate branch of the Red Cross. It's a club that say our club is all about helping the Red Cross. We are so we're helping to pay for Red Cross hospitals over in France or Iraq or Italy, and we're also filling it with stuff. So this is a map of Clay County, Minnesota. So I'll just mention it. So over here, this is Moorhead, Minnesota. That's the biggest town in Clay County. Right across the river would be Fargo, North Dakota. And then there's Dilworth, that's a railroad town. Down here is Barnesville and Hawley. And then we got smaller towns like Ulen and Felton and Georgetown and Craigness, Holy Cross, down here Sabin. So this is Clay County. And this, I bet you all my baseball cards that if your family was in the USA 100 years ago, your family were Red Cross volunteers. Everybody was. Each one of these little dots here did something. Like Keene Township. There weren't any towns in Keene Township. It's just a bunch of farmers. 25 farmers donated the crops off of 24.5 acres of land to the Keene branch of the Red Cross. And all the crops went to pay for Red Cross. This one here, Moorhead. The Moorhead High School Auxiliary formed a week after the U.S. started the war, with 92 founding members. All of them were girls, and that's an important part about the Red Cross. There was a lot of sexism going on 100 years ago, and the Red Cross was one of the few places where one of the few organizations that let women be in charge. And that is probably why they were so well run and were able to do so much, is because all the smartest women in America were putting their efforts towards the Red Cross. There's a lot of smart women in America, aren't there? So there's a lot of things that we did. One of the things that we did, here's a photo of the Thortfett family. They're farmers near Glendon, Minnesota, which is between Moorhead and Hawley. And they're having a picnic, and all the money goes to the Red Cross. An interesting thing about the Thortfett family is they're actually against the war. This was not actually a popular war for a lot of America, but they weren't against helping people. They were raising money for the Red Cross. Another thing that we all did for the Red Cross is we knitted like crazy, because we need 4 million soldiers to win this war, 4 million American soldiers, which means we need 4 million sweaters, don't we? The U.S. Army doesn't have a sweater factory. These sweaters are made by your great-great-grandmas. And once you're done knitting sweaters, our boys need socks. Knit your bit. And do you think that maybe our soldiers need some bandages during this war? Absolutely. So here's some posters here. You can have a Red Cross service flag in your window. If you have a family member who's part of the Red Cross, you get to put that piece of paper in your window. And speaking of the Thortvetts, here's a picture of them knitting. A bunch of ladies from the Thortfett family photo album. And then here, and do you think that our hospitals overseas, do you think we need nurses? That's one of the things that we can stock these hospitals with, is American nurses. We asked every nurse in the country, would you be willing to serve in a war hospital in World War I? 10,000 American women said yes. So it's not just local Clay County boys who are going overseas, it's a lot of local girls too, that are helping out in France. And one of those girls named Rose Clark. Rose Clark grew up in Barnesville, moved to Moorhead. She was a nurse, and she volunteered to be a Red Cross nurse. in a frontline World War I hospital. And she was 3 miles from the fighting at the Battle of Chateau Thierry, which was the turning point of the war, where the American soldiers stopped the German offensive. And Rose Clark wrote home, she wrote, "Just tell the women at home not to throw down the job of making dressings." She means bandages. "If you could see how many we use just here, we try to be saving as possible, but one man sometimes has as many as 8 or 9 wounds. The Red Cross means so much, and the boys almost cry when they know it's being done for them." Oh, and I just got to tell you with the story of one interesting, this is kind of a fun poster too. This is the Moorhead Normal School. They had a bunch of clubs. That's a college. It's Minnesota State University, Moorhead now. That college had a bunch of different clubs, of girls, the Allies, the Bugle Call, Old Glory, Pershing, Betsy Ross, Gaminichi, Wetches, etc. And they all competed to see how many sweaters they could make, how many socks they could make, how many helmets, that's kind of like stocking caps that soldiers could wear in the winter, or wristers, which is kind of like like mittens, except you can still use your trigger finger if you're a soldier. And I want to tell you one more story about the traveling cake. So we had carnivals, and the carnivals would go to the Red Cross. All the money would go to the Red Cross. So think of like a big county fair. And there was one cake that made the rounds. So all the little county fairs, all the little town fairs in Hall, in Clay County, in Norman County, all over the place. And people would compete to see how much money they could pay for this cake. And then once they bought the cake, they wouldn't even eat it. They just took it to the next fair, and then they would sell it again. And so this cake went to a whole bunch of fairs, and when it got to Hawley, it sold for $640. Can you imagine paying $640 for a cake you don't even eat? And that's actually $640 is a lot more money in 1918. That is the equivalent of, you could buy a car for less than $640. So that is a lot of money. People were trying to be as generous as possible to the Red Cross in World War I. So, and does anybody here have a family member or a friend who's a nurse or a doctor? They're real heroes. You should thank them. All right, it's time to raise an army. We need 4 million American soldiers to win this war, and Uncle Sam wants you to join the army. Have you ever seen this poster before? This poster comes from World War I. And there are 2 ways that we are going to raise 4 million soldiers and sailors. One is that we're going to ask people to enlist, which means I volunteer, I want to be a soldier, I want to join the Army or the Navy. Or we're going to draft people. And that's when the government says, all right, we're going to pick you, and you're going to be soldiers and fight in France. Is that okay? Doesn't matter. It's going to happen anyway. So today, and for a long time now, all the soldiers and sailors and airmen in our military and Marines in our military, everybody volunteers. We all enlist. And it's been that way for a long time. The last time we drafted anybody is the Vietnam War in the 1970s. So for you kids at home, you might want to ask your grandpas about that. They're probably the right age that if they didn't get drafted for the war, maybe some of them did get drafted for the war, if they didn't get drafted for the war, they were probably scared of getting drafted for the war, or they knew people who were drafted for the war. And one interesting thing about where we live here in Clay County, Minnesota, is that we were an immigrant community. We were a bunch of immigrant communities. This is a nation of immigrants. Everybody's family comes from somewhere. And here in Clay County, Minnesota, about 70, almost 70% of the people who lived here 100 years ago were either born in another country or their parents were born in another country. And there were 64 soldiers from Clay County who died in this war. And 1 out of every 5 of them had a parent born in a country that we were at war with. So when everybody's in this world war, not all the countries that our families came from were on the side that we're fighting with. So the most common place for that to happen is Germans. Germans were the biggest immigrant group to the United States of the 1800s, and there were a lot of German Americans here. For example, my great-grandpa was a USA World War I soldier, and both his parents were born in Germany. So when he was going to war, he might have been shooting at his cousins. But another source for soldiers who were fighting against their cousins was the Ottoman Empire. I want to introduce you to Nasib Shaheen. Nasib Shaheen is the first soldier from Moorhead to volunteer to fight in this war. And he volunteered to fight even though the country that he was born in, we were actually at war with. So this is, he was born on today what we would call the Syria-Lebanon border over in the Middle East. I know there's a lot of Moorhead kids from Iraq or Kurdistan. It's over in that area. But back then, 100 years ago, we called it the Ottoman Empire. And they were one of the Axis power, the Central Powers, the Central Powers that we were fighting against. Nasib Shaheen and a lot of other immigrant Americans or sons of immigrants, sons of German immigrants, they fought for the USA anyway. And Nasib died in France on May 27, 1918. He's buried in France. All right, let's talk about the fight, the battles in France. America was not in this war for very long, but we were absolutely crucial to this war, to winning this war. If we wouldn't have, I think that if we would not have been there, I think most people would think that America had not been in this fight, the Allies would have lost the war. We prevented the Allies from losing the war in the big 1918 German spring offensives. The American soldiers were some of the most important soldiers that stopped the Germans from taking Paris and winning the war. And America was also very important in winning the war. And it came at a very high price. So this is America's 3rd deadliest war. Number 1 is the Civil War. That's the deadliest war in American history. Number 2 is World War II. And number 3 is World War I, the 3rd deadliest war in American history. But what makes that really scary is that it's also one of our shortest wars. We were in the Civil War and in World War II for like 4 or 5 years each. We were in World War I for a year and a half. And really, it took us a long time to get an army together and start fighting. We were really only in combat for about 6 months. And in 6 months, we lost more American soldiers killed than in the 20 years we fought in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War, we know what a terrible war that is. So it's strange that we don't talk about World War I more. So over here we have all of these artifacts from local soldiers. All of this stuff was actually in the fighting in the trenches of France. I should mention a little bit about who we were fighting. So our best friends in this war was England, and well, actually France was our very closest friend. France, England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India, Pakistan, South Africa. A lot of African countries were on our side, Morocco. And the people we were fighting against was Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, that's Turkey and a lot of the Middle East. So what, and most of the battlefields that Americans were, America's friend was Italy too. I forgot Italy. One of what we're most afraid of in World War I was this thing. It looks like a waste paper basket. That is actually a German artillery shell. So think of it like a big bullet filled with explosives. That's the garbage part. The explosive part would have been maybe about up to there. You put that in a cannon. Here, I'll show you a picture of that. You put that in a cannon, and the explosive part shoots out the front, and the garbage part, the shell, the like we have a copy of one over there. That's something like this. That's the garbage part. You can see it just shoots out the back. And wherever that artillery shell lands, it creates a huge explosion, and you don't want to be anywhere near that. And then it creates a crater like on the moon, and then hot shards of metal fly in every direction. Those hot shards of metal, it's called shrapnel. And if you get in the way of those hot shards of metal, it's going to go right through you or stick inside you. So 70% of all the soldiers who died in this war were killed by artillery shells, explosions, or shrapnel. And so that's why, to protect ourselves, we lived in trenches. And there was a big, think of it like a big ditch, so that if it explodes over here or over there, us in our trenches would be safe from the artillery shells. But there's some trees in the background of this photograph. Most World War I battlefields, all the trees had blown up. It looks like the moon. Nothing grows there because it all blew up. And here's a map of the battlefields. We had trenches all that went from, all through France, from the Swiss border to the English Channel. And then right across from our trenches, the enemy had trenches too. And if you take this line, how long the trenches were, put it on a map of Minnesota, it's about the same distance from, St. Paul to Pembina. It's about the size of Minnesota, and that's the battlefields of World War I. So here is a big photo of soldiers in trenches. And trenches were really good for defense, but they were also pretty terrible to live in, because for a lot of reasons. In fact, let's list some off. You live in a ditch. What happens when it rains? Yeah, you're standing in mud. All the soldiers in World War I will complain about mud. Martin Nelson wrote home, "There is nothing here but ruins and mud and trenches and mud and work and mud and some more mud clear up to your suspender buttons. We live in a state of perpetual dampness." And what happens if your feet are wet for 2 weeks straight is they start to rot. They can even rot off. It's called trench foot. They can rot off. All the boys had cooties. Cooties is what you call lice back then. It doesn't matter what you do, you're going to get lice if you're a World War I soldier. Rats were everywhere. And they were fat as cats, crawling all over the place, crawling over you while you slept. Attacking was terrible. It's called going over the top. So because we climbed over the top of the trench, and then we ran through, there's this over the top, and then we ran through no man's land. That's the space between our trenches and the trenches and the German trenches. There's this between our trenches and the enemy trenches. There's a space of land, a couple of football fields wide usually, that neither side controlled. So we called it no man's land, and it's just filled with craters and full of water and stuff that's blown up and dead bodies. And even the air was poisonous. All the soldiers had to have one of these, a gas mask, because by 1918, when America got in the fight, about one out of every 4 artillery shells didn't blow up. They released poison gas. And if we breathed it in, we would cough, we'd choke, If we breathe in a little, if we breathe in too much, if we'd go to the hospital. If we breathe in more than that, we could die. But, and so in order to prevent poison gas attacks, we'd have to use our sniffers, because we'd have to smell. We usually smell the gas before we saw it, and there was a lot of different gases, but these are the most common. Chlorine gas. If it smelled like you were at the pool, then that's chlorine gas. That's going to make you cough, and you don't want that. If it smelled like somebody just mowed the lawn, that's the deadliest gas of the war. That's phosgene gas. And if it smelled like horseradish or mustard, that's mustard gas. They call it the king of gases. They use it a lot. It wasn't really good at killing people. Only 3% of people who died of gas deaths were caused by mustard gas. What it was really good at is sending everybody to the hospital, and that's just as good if you're a German about to attack. You pour you release mustard gas on your enemy, and then you attack, because they can't fight back. Because mustard gas is an oily yellow cloud, and wherever it spreads, if it gets on your skin, then it turns into a blister like you just touched the stove. If it gets on your clothes, then it'll infect your clothes, and it'll get on your skin and it'll give you a blister. If you breathe it in, your insides blister. And if it gets in your eyes blister. So it was no fun. Mustard gas was awful. So it is no fun. If I could pick one war to not be at in world history, I pick World War I. All right, this is a terrible war. Let's end the war. The best part about World War I is the end. And you can always remember when World War I ends. It ended on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 o'clock, 1918, 11/11/11. And that's when both sides said, let's stop shooting at each other. And the big word for let's stop shooting at each other is armistice. So that's why they called it Armistice Day. And it was such a happy moment in the world history because it was such a terrible war. It was the end of such a terrible war that today we still celebrate Armistice Day every year with a national holiday. Does anybody know what holiday we celebrate on November 11? Veterans Day. And it's not just USA's Veterans Day, it's Canada's Veterans Day, it's Poland's Veterans Day, it's a lot of people's Veterans Day all around the world. And that's when the Germans said, enough, we lost the war, let's stop shooting at each other. And here's a photograph of a bunch of American soldiers who just found out they survived the war. How happy do they look? That's 11/11/11, a bunch of American soldiers. And Harold Golder, he wrote home. The best part of it was, I was on the front line when the armistice was signed and could see what a blessing peace is. No more shells screaming over your head or bursting within a few feet of you, only a blissful peace over everything. But when it's 11 a.m. in France, is it 11 a.m. in Minnesota? No, we found out that the war ended at 1:45 a.m., the middle of the night. And the first guy in Moorhead to find out who the war was over, he ran to the mayor's house, he woke the mayor up out of bed, and the mayor said, all right, I know it's the middle of the night, but nobody's going to want to wait to hear the news. So he ordered the fire siren to blow to wake everybody up. And do you think people were mad? Not that day. You do that tonight, I'll be mad at you, but not on November 11th, 1918. People heard that the war was going to be over pretty soon. They heard rumors, and when they heard the siren blow in the middle of the night, they knew what it meant. They got out. Some people had keys to the churches. They started ringing the church bells all night. Some people had keys to the trains, the railroad guys. They rang the train sirens all night. And Moorhead was partying so hard all night that we woke up Glendon. 7 miles away, the Thortvedt sisters. We read in their diaries, victory, war is over, also Mama's birthday. Telephone is busy this morning. At 3 a.m. this morning, Adele and I woke. I dreamed I heard our threshing engine whistle, which is a farm machinery, which is odd in the middle of the night, but which proved to have been the whistles in Moorhead and Fargo. It was then a tremendous blowing of whistles, ringing of train bells and church bells. It impressed us beyond words. I woke Pa. Whistles blew every half hour until daylight. We knew what it meant. Peace, the war is over. A wave of joy throughout the world. Now if only Goodwin, that's her brother who's in the Army, if Goodwin and the rest of our boys were all right, we are perfectly happy. So the next day, all throughout the world, even here in Moorhead and Barnesville, spontaneous parties popped up in London, Paris, even Berlin. Even though Germany lost the war, they were still happy the war was over. And the Thortvedt sisters went into Moorhead and had a party, partied with the rest of us. And while they were in Moorhead, their dad got a really scary phone call. Their dad, Levi Thortvedt, got a scary phone call. Nobody had called a ceasefire with Spanish influenza. So their dad got a phone, he got a phone call. He picked up the phone, and there was somebody from the War Department reading a telegram in a really scratchy voice over the line. He couldn't quite hear him. All he heard was, garble, 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 died of pneumonia yesterday. And pneumonia usually means he got it from Spanish influenza. And if it's from the War Department, Levi immediately thought that it was his son Goodwin, who was in an army hospital. He had been shot over in France. He was wounded in combat in France, and now he was in a hospital, and that's just as dangerous too, because there's so many soldiers who were getting the flu. But he asked him to repeat. He asked the guy on the phone other side of the phone to repeat himself, and he found out. He said it again, and he could hear that it wasn't Goodwin, his son, who was killed, who died of influenza yesterday. It was Thor Sheridan. Thor Sheridan was his farmhand who lived at his house, a good friend of Levi Thortvedt's, who got drafted to serve in the army. And Thor Sheridan died of influenza. And Levi Thortvedt was immediately relieved that it wasn't his son that died. And then immediately after that, sad, because his friend Thor died, and he felt guilty for actually feeling relief that it was his friend Thor instead of his son that died.